Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne, and today, May 10th, 2018, I'll be talking with Dr. Isa Blumi at Stockholm University. Isa Blumi is an historian. He's currently a senior lecturer and associate professor at the Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies. Over the past 2 decades, he's been teaching and researching at universities in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. And he's the author of many books, including his latest book, Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And here is that interview. Hello, Dr. Blumi. Welcome to Around the Empire.
Good morning. Nice to be with you.
It's great to have you. Thanks for taking the time. I listened to your recent KPFA interview, and that's what triggered me to almost immediately contact you because I really wanted to interview you. As you know, because you've been in the United States, the narrative about the war in Yemen is very simplified here, and I would venture to say that most Americans don't even know why we are in that war. But the narrative that we're fed from the media is that it's a Saudi war, and some rebel radical Yemenis. Actually, it started before that. First, it was that Al Qaeda was in Yemen, and we had to go over and fight the war on terror. But then, in the 2014-15 range, we were told that President Hadi was ousted from the country, and it was important to the Saudis to be able to have a good relationship or control of the government in Yemen, and we needed to go and try to reinstall him as president. I never really bought that, but I thought that was some form of it. I thought it had to do with Saudi control over Yemen. But in more recent months and years, it started to look like something entirely different. But I could never quite put my finger on what that was until I listened to your recent interview. So I followed the war in Yemen, not extensively, but definitely more than most Americans. But no matter how much I read about it, I still found it hard to get a grasp. So if we could take a similar approach in this interview and talk about how, to paraphrase how KPFA put it, they said the war in Yemen today is mischaracterized as a civil war. It's a war about the empire, a globalized economy, international finance, resources, and it has, to quote the KPFA, quote, a deep colonial history that stretches back to the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and currently the American Empire. So I have not read your recent book, Destroying Yemen, yet, but I've read a little bit about it, and I'd like to just quote the extract that appears on the University of California Press page. And it says, since March 2015, a Saudi-led international coalition of forces, supported by Britain and the United States, has waged a devastating war in Yemen. Largely ignored by the world's media, the resulting humanitarian disaster and full-scale famine threatens millions. Destroying Yemen offers the first in-depth historical account of the transnational origins of this war, placing it in the illuminating context of Yemen's relationship with the major powers since the Cold War, bringing new sources and a deep understanding to bear on Yemen's profound, unwitting implication in international affairs. This explosive book ultimately tells an even larger story of today's political economy of global capitalism, development, and the war on terror as disparate actors intersect in Arabia. So I basically want you to tell the story in whatever way you would like. But the big question is, whose war is this? In the U.S., as I said, we're told it's Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, and it's because of their need to have Yemen as a puppet state, or at least to have great influence over Yemen. But more recently, the narrative has shifted toward this being a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that Yemen is a security threat to the kingdom. So your book paints, and your interviews paint a bigger picture, a longer struggle, and interests that are, I think, largely hidden from the American public or lost in the complicated details. So if you could tell us first a little bit about the last 100 years and what Yemen used to be like and how it was transformed by empire.
Okay, well, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you more in depth about this rather tragic, yet not unique story of interactions between indigenous peoples and the encroachment of global empire throughout the 19th and 20th century. And I think it's a good point to begin by reminding your listeners that first and foremost, it's also a mystery to most of the world. It's not only the Americans who are often blamed as being ignorant, an ignorant empire or a society that is disengaged from the actual projection of power that ultimately benefits them in one way or the other. It is in fact a global campaign to not necessarily silence, but maintain an order of ignorance about what is actually happening on the ground. And this is in stark contrast to what's happening elsewhere in the region, which does get its own kind of spin through the mainstream media, as well as, let's say, unconventional media as well, by the way. Very few people who actually cover from a so-called progressive side also fail to mention Yemen with much attention, and certainly not with much attention for the details or for new kinds of ways of framing this conflict. Because it is a conflict that, again, has deep roots. It's very much in a structure of global expansion of certain vested interests. Yemen had long been a target for certain groups of people either representing or trying to establish themselves as the main engines for a certain kind of imperial project that would become known as the United States over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And why Yemen has always been an area of focus for competing external powers is, one, it's a wealthy society. It's a generator of wealth, of surplus wealth. There was huge stores of saved wealth in the country itself, and it projected that wealth both culturally as well as materially, externally throughout the Indian Ocean world and throughout the larger Islamic world. The moment the Islamic world became in direct conflict with the expansion of global capital, especially finance capital, at the end of the 19th century onwards, Yemen necessarily became a target for some form or another of imperial conquest. Now, the form it took under the guise of the British East India Company was the creation of partnerships with various sultanates, what we would ultimately call southern Yemen, which remains today in many ways transformed by this relationship with a global capitalist venture called East India Company.
And that would be the part of Yemen, Aden, and the coastline on the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean?
That's correct, but also more importantly an area called Hadramaut, which has long been a spiritual center for pilgrimage, for erudite Muslims from around the world to come and study. And it so happens to be also an extremely wealthy part of the Arabian Peninsula, where much of today's, what we would call Yemen's oil and gas is to be found, at least onshore. And this is an area that was largely untouched by British administrators. They would basically outsource the responsibility of maintaining some kind of stability in the larger sphere of influence to locals. And it would be Aden that was primarily the area of concern for what an empire that became more or less attached to India and survived and can basically understand all of its subsequent enterprises, whether it be taking over the Suez Canal, initiating the finance of the canal in the first place, to build it in the 1860s, to conquest of the Gulf and forging similar kinds of relationships with the various families that now rule in the Gulf, as well as its very aggressive policy towards what we call today Iraq and Iran, are all predicated on securing some kind of access to the Indian Ocean world, East Asia, and India. So Aden played that role. And because it was not yet seen as an area to actually produce significant surplus wealth, it was left primarily to locals to administer these areas, and who would benefit from working in direct cahoots with British Empire. Now, in order for that to happen, however, effectively, was Aden and some of its smaller ports were important stations for ships that went and traveled between Britain, Europe, and South Asia and the Far East. You needed workers. So demographically, something is beginning to happen in the beginning of the 19th and extends to the early 20th century to southern Yemen, where not only has it a long tradition of sending Yemenis to the rest of the world as traders, as intellectuals, as spiritual leaders, and ultimately political leaders. Many of the political elites of Southeast Asia, for instance, actually have claim to Yemeni heritage, as do many of the families in the Gulf, including the current ruling family in Abu Dhabi.
Really?
So, yes, and this will be an important part of this story about the so-called coalition that I'll get to in a second, that makes it much more complicated for us to than we generally presented to us, and indeed explain why there's an internal war within the so-called war on Yemen.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting part of the
right.
That's really hidden in my view.
Yeah. So quickly to get through this process of initially explaining how empire becomes heavily invested in this territory called we call today Yemen. Again, Aden and the ports are primarily used as coaling stations and points of transit where British companies, as well as locals, would benefit financially from or economically from this very vibrant commercial exchanges taking place. The British Empire grows. The people living and benefiting in this relationship with the British Empire also grows. And it extends from Hong Kong to ports in India to the Gulf, as well as South Yemen. In the north, however, this is an area that is impossible to actually occupy. It's the area that's currently now under siege for the last now 3.5, well, we're into the fourth year of war being brought to the vast majority of people who live in Yemen are actually in this area we call North Yemen. And that has long been under a very interesting relationship between the Ottoman Empire and what we call the Imamate. And then by, let's say, end of First World War, the Imamate secures influence and control over much of what we call the highlands of North Yemen.
This would be Sana'a and the area near the border with, I understand the border is not exactly defined, but let's say the border with Saudi Arabia.
Right. So Saudi Arabia is only an entity that is created with the collusion of British interests in the 1920s. So we're still talking about a time when there is not maybe in a small territory of Eastern Arabia, there's a family called Saud ibn Saud, a brother who defied the Ottoman Empire and joined the British and became a kind of an important point of influence for British actors at the beginning of the 20th century. By World War I, after World War I, heavy investment in the Wahhabism and Ibn Saud allows the British to extend their influence at the expense of resilient other polities in Arabian Peninsula. I wish I could show you a map and explain this. I have a perfect map to show just what happens over the course of some 10, 15 years after World War I, when the British weapons, British money, British influence help the rise of this, what eventually will become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, projecting both eastward, taking over key spots of the coast of the Persian Arab Gulf, but more importantly, moving northwards towards what becomes British-occupied Mesopotamia or Iraq, as well as what will eventually become Jordan, Palestine, and the Hijaz, which is the areas that have long been an important center of commerce, just like southern Yemen, because Mecca and Medina are there. The big port city of Jeddah is there. And here the British were able to conquer basically the heart and soul of Islam with the help of Wahhabism, this radical Takfiri Islam, and the Saud family. And they did this in mid-1920s. And they proceeded to move southwards after conquering Mecca and Medina towards Yemeni territories. And it's at this point in time when in North Yemen itself, this polity around this charismatic, what we'd call Zaydi leader named Imam Yahya, is consolidating his authority over this incredibly wealthy, agriculturally wealthy country that if you've seen pictures of Yemen, you see it most likely from the perspective of these hilltop villages, these kind of quite remarkable city like Sana'a or Ib and Taiz. Right. These are all cities that thrived on commerce, but mostly agricultural-based commerce. The coffee that first attracted the attention of the world in the 17th and 18th century originated from this area and was exported from a port called Mocha. So Mocha coffee, if you know the term associated with coffee, it's coming from this port. And this area is all now under one kind of administrative regime, if you will, under the imamate. And they are facing first the British and the British allied sultanates of the South Arabia, but also now this British expansionist enterprise called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to its north. And ultimately, the clashes take place in an area called the Asir, which would ultimately become de facto Saudi territory per a peace treaty that would have to be renewed every some 20 years between the imamate of North Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And it would be basically form what today is known to be the border between Saudi Arabia and larger Yemen. And this is a key point of conflict that will remain so because it was contested zone. It was always never clear who ruled over this area. It was largely left to the local population to move across, back and forth, continue their day-to-day functioning. This allowed for Saudi Arabia actually to supply cheap labor, various drugs that was popular in the black markets of Saudi Arabia throughout the 20th century, all flowed through this area. It was a very porous border. And it was only in 2000, year 2000, when with the Americans insisting that they consolidate and solidify and militarize its frontiers, the frontiers of Saudi Arabia, that a big issue comes to play between the local population, Saudi Arabia, and a form of empire. But I need to step back before I get into that complicated story.
Okay, sure.
And just continue with this narrative that in the Middle East in general, after World War I, the British and the French, who were the main beneficiaries of victory in Europe, translated that in some form or another in direct or indirect rule of the Middle East. Indirect rule was usually the style of the British. It was more cost effective, especially after World War I when they were more or less bankrupt. And they could barely maintain an empire that extended to East Asia and certainly the Gulf. But they used these proxies like the Saud family, who harnessed the most radical form of Sunni Salafist Islam, Takfirism, which is the kind of reference to all other Muslims who do not profess loyalty to this political order, to this certain kind of legal interpretation of the Quran and the use of Hadith, are considered kafir, takfir. They are therefore can be vulnerable to punishment, even death. And this is the kind of very aggressive form of political Islam that we today associate with not necessarily even Al-Qaeda, but Al-Daesh or ISIS, right? Mm-hmm. This originated with this collusion between the British Empire, global capitalism, and the Saud family, which made a kingdom out of nothing in the 1920s at the expense of many different polities throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And one important place where this could not and would not be able to expand was North Yemen. And for a number of reasons why it's too complicated to explain, North Yemen was very cohesive and resisted, not necessarily on sectarian lines, but also it just didn't make sense, this kind of project of radical Wahhabism. It basically destroys commerce. It destroys interconnectivity. It destroys societies that are multilingual, that are cosmopolitan. And fortunately, Yemenis were able to resist this.
Did they recognize it as a tool of subjugation?
Yes, indeed. If you look at the documentation already when the 1920s, when the British are occasionally trying to occupy key assets of the coastal areas of North Yemen, even with the signing of this agreement in 1934, there is a British hand in it. And it's quite clear that the British are playing some kind of role of mediating between these two competing powers, local powers, over this territory we call the Asir. Now, we can't forget that in the interwar period, the British are bankrupt. They rely on these kind of local intermediaries, proxies, if you will. But at the same time, it's the beginning of the rise of the United States. Italy is also still a player in the global scene. Italy still has territories that it has invested in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And indeed, Italy is one of these countries that would sign economic and other kinds of treaties with North Yemen. Even the Soviet Union, in the earliest stages of the Soviet Union's overtures to the Middle East, one of the first places the Soviet Union has diplomatic relations with is with North Yemen.
They had a naval base of some sort there, didn't they?
That's after World War II, correct, in southern Yemen, but that's only after the 1960s. In the 1950s, now we're moving after World War I, this continued relationship of balancing off global powers allows North Yemen to be a very active player in the progressive movement against colonialism and imperialism coming from Europe and the United States. But let me again just briefly make this point about the fact that North Yemen, this so-called backward medieval monarchy, the terminology is always used this way in order to make it confusing as to what was going on, proved to be actually, in many senses, one, very astute about the way the world worked, even in the 1920s and 30s, but also very good at keeping a cohesive society that was otherwise very diverse. You constantly are hearing references to sectarian divisions and ancient hatreds in the Middle East. All those components are there in North Yemen, but for a number of complicated reasons, this imam is keeping this together. And it's this point of resistance. And it's so interesting because this is where the Americans, initially, they have no other place for them to go because it's either British or French sphere of influence. So the Americans are trying to find access points on the kind of fringes of the Middle East. And so a geologist who represents the early oil companies of the 1920s and 30s, he spends his first portion of his career trying to convince the imam of North Yemen to allow him to go and inspect what he suspects are important areas of oil underneath the surface of territories of Yemen. And lo and behold, he's discovering that there is oil in many of these parts of North Yemen. But at some point, the imam is suspicious of this Tutwiler guy and tells him to leave, that he doesn't like this guy poking around and demanding to go into places where it's seemingly of no economic or, let's say, scientific value. So he's clearly suspicious that this guy, this American, is up to no good. So he throws him out. And it's this guy who then goes to Saudi Arabia, and he's the one who initiates the Aramco project.
And his name again?
Tutwiler. He's associated. If your listeners go to the book by Robert Vitalis about Aramco, America's Kingdom, you will find a brief reference about his early career. I'm sorry, his name is Carl Twitchell. I mispronounced his name. Twitchell, Carl Twitchell, Twitchell. Okay. So here you have the example where if the man was corrupt, he could have easily taken the money from this Twitchell guy who's represents these oil companies that are being established in Oklahoma and Texas, right, in the 30s. who then ultimately goes and establishes a very much more pliable relationship with Saud, Ibn Saud, and then ultimately pushes the British aside entirely from Saudi Arabia. By World War II, Saudi Arabia is America's little kingdom, right? And that being said, North Yemen remains independent. And after World War II, with the creation of the United Nations, I have in my book all these very interesting stories that you find in the American archives that are still trying to recruit North Yemen. They're still trying to get northern Yemenis to somehow fall into the fold of American sphere of influence. And that's largely because the British, despite the fact that they're now completely dependent on the Americans in European theater, still consider themselves an empire elsewhere.
Right.
And so they're holding on to South Yemen with dear life because, okay, they lose India by 1948. They manipulate the independence of India, just like in many other places in Africa, with the use of sectarianism, with the use of class differences, the use of regionalism. So India is torn apart by this horrible war that would lead to millions of deaths in 1948 to 1950, the creation of Pakistan in India, what I'm referring to. Similarly, there's this very violent attempts to keep power and authority and influence over Eastern Africa. So again, Aden plays an important strategic position for the British. They can control somewhat the access to the Red Sea, to the Suez Canal, which they are ultimately thrown out by 1950s by the rise of a combination of American influence as well as pan-Arab nationalism. And what's so fascinating about this whole story with pan-Arab nationalism, often associated with the progressive forces in Egypt or in Syria and Iraq, especially with Abdel Nasser, who is seen as the leader of this movement to push aside British and French imperialism in the Middle East, joined forces with the non-alignment movement, which includes Yugoslavia and Indonesia before the coup there, and India and other countries, is North Yemen. The Imam Yahya, who is killed in 1948, his son, Imam Ahmed, proves to be equally astute and clever and knows how to balance off the great powers. Throughout the 1950s, he's inviting Maoist China. He's inviting Yugoslavia. He's inviting Soviet Union. He's inviting Yugoslavia, Sweden, even some other European countries, but to make sure that there's a balance. And he's allowing all these competing interests to build his infrastructure. They build his roads, they build his bridges, they build his ports. And in the meantime, his government is one of the first ones to condemn the creation of Israel. His government is one of the first ones to support the Free Officers movement that overthrows the Khedive in Egypt and the ushering in of a new era in Egyptian politics, progressive politics. He's one of the first ones to actually push for a pan-Arab state. He's a signatory. His government is a signatory to this initial attempts to create a unified Arab republic. And again, it's bizarre if you read the literature about this, again, isolated, so-called backwards monarchy, that they are actually the ones promoting the unification of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Yemen into some kind of collective shared defense mechanism.
It is. It's stunning,
yeah,
really.
Yeah, and he's providing safe haven for these radical Palestinian groups, for George Habash, others who find themselves a safe haven in Taiz, which was then the capital of North Yemen. He's allowing them to infiltrate into South Yemen. He's arming these guys who are fighting the British in South Yemen in a very brutal war that only ends in 1967. If you look at British fascination with empire and with the soldiers who tell all their stories, one of the places where you'll find the most popular public memoirs about empire's demise is the struggle over South Yemen. So the British hold South Yemen very closely to their hearts and to their memories as empire, and they're very bitter about losing South Yemen. And they're very bitter about losing South Yemen for another reason. They begin to realize there's lots and lots of oil there. The problem is for Britain is that they're bankrupt. They have no means, one, to exploit those oil resources. It's already an American, let's say the big sister, Seven Sisters game, right? But BP certainly does not have the means to invest in an imperial project that would have to subdue South Yemen. militarily. It's basically a lost cause. And it's largely because North Yemen is allowing for the infiltration of weapons and soldiers from their side into southern Yemen. So, and all of this ultimately explodes when, again, this imam, he dies, his son takes over. He's more or less projected to do the exact same thing for another generation to resist empire, to help those who are resisting empire. There's a coup. And as happens in many parts in the early 1960s of the newly emerging independent states of Africa or elsewhere in the world, of Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, the use of coups, the use of proxies, the use of mercenaries is entered into the fray. And North Yemen is basically brought into war for almost 8 years. Hundreds of thousands will die. It's an invitation for the Americans, Saudi Arabia, for Egypt, all to get into the fray. And it becomes this nasty kind of larger regional war playing itself out in North Yemen itself. And in some ways, it could be seen as a precursor to the war we're seeing today. Although the conditions are and the reasons why Yemen has to be destroyed today is a little bit different. So that maybe allows me now to, after a long-winded introduction, but why Yemen has this history of resistance to empire, why empire is heavily invested in trying to harness the human resources as well as the material resources of this country. It's a complicated, interesting way of how empire implicates itself, especially the Americans, through USAID and many of its so-called soft power mechanisms that American empire does so effectively well in infiltrating societies that otherwise were initially inaccessible to American, especially American capital. And again, North Yemen had long kept America at arm's length. They had long allowed competing outside interests to balance off the kinds of power and demands that economic hitmen that John Perkins often has been able to articulate for American audiences. They were definitely American hitmen, economic hitmen in operation throughout the 50s and 60s in Yemen. And it's only after this nasty war, which included Egyptian invasion, Saudi invasion, and then ultimately a civil war that lasted 8 years, that the Americans gained finally access to North Yemen.
Where are we in the 1970s now?
This is now 1970s, and it's at this time South Yemen has already brushed off the British. It's become an ardent Marxist state where you see the introduction of Soviets, especially Soviet advisors. Aden becomes an important port for the Soviet Union. South Yemen goes the direction of social engineering projects that much like you would find throughout the rest of the progressive world, women are gain access to education. Women are included in the administration of their local societies. You have the state centralization of the economy. Interestingly enough, even though the Soviet geologists know there's lots of oil there too, it still does not make economic sense. It's just too expensive to start the drilling process. It's still, you would need pipelines, you would need infrastructure built in the ports, and it just was not economically viable. There was too much available petroleum around the world at this stage. Recall that until the Nixon surprise, right, and until the Vietnam War puts all kinds of pressure on the U.S. dollar that ultimately forces Nixon to drop the gold standard altogether. And until the petrodollar comes into play in 1973-74, oil is basically the way the global capitalism could only function on the premise that oil is dirt cheap. And indeed, because with the help of Saudi Arabia and the newly created Gulf states that all were more or less in the hand of empire, oil was flowing freely. There were other parts of the world that did see war and violence in order to assure that oil would flow freely, especially with Mossadegh and Iran in early 1950s. But Iraq would become one of those kinds of epicenters of tensions, as would Yemen, but not necessarily for oil. North Yemen became important because again, it was seen as this last bastion of resistance in the larger context, which people have forgotten today. They've just always assumed it was isolated, where it was not. It was a kind of an area where people can actually go and formulate a aggressive agenda, if you will, against global empire. So when South Yemen is now the most Marxist of all Marxist states and has developed a capacity to defend itself, it's already had many years of guerrilla warfare against the British. It now is given modern weapons by the Soviet Union. It becomes the kind of very dangerous kind of position in the Indian Ocean world. So the last thing that anybody wanted, supposedly, was North Yemen to becoming part of this larger Yemeni project, connected in the Cold War sense with the Soviet Union. The problem is that, again, Yemenis were demonstrating, despite this long 8 years of civil war, they demonstrated a human capacity. They had quite brilliant minds at work in North Yemen and very still vigilant in regards to their independence. They despised the Saudis. They despised their neighbors to the north. They were very suspicious constantly of the Americans, who were now, with the embassy, trying to infiltrate into larger society with their Pepsi Cola and with their offers of agricultural aid, the use of agricultural chemicals. They kept pushing Yemenis to transform their society into when you read reports from the embassy in the mid-70s, into a net importer of food and a net exporter of cash crops.
Because at this point they were still pretty self-sufficient. They had a strong agricultural economy.
That's right. It was a country that it periodically saw, because it's a country that depends on monsoons from the Indian Ocean complex. So whenever there's when the rains don't come, when projected, then you can have some kind of shortages. And so there was always concern in certain areas with famine. And those were always entry points, kind of like disaster capitalism early examples of where American and UN agencies can infiltrate areas when there was need, temporary need, not structural transformations, not forcing an entire society to start importing cheap wheat and flour from America, but just, temporary support. And this is where the Americans were constantly being pushed back by Yemenis themselves. It was a sovereign state that still had some control over its borders and basically had an eye for its future, which would continue to thrive on a couple of things. First, its incredible human resources, very hardworking people who were working in large amounts in the Gulf, in the oil industry. They were the ones who were building the roads for these now booming post-1973 oil economies in the Gulf. You had Yemenis by the tens of thousands in California and other places where, again, at various points in time in the 20th century, labor was in demand. So Yemen was trapped in this kind of global imperialist machine that extracted cheap labor from certain areas and sent them off elsewhere. And by the 1970s, money was flowing back through remittances from these millions of workers, on top of the fact that it was producing and self-sufficient in food, that it was not such a mechanized economy, that it didn't need to import now oil that was coming at $14, $15 a barrel, thanks to the oil crisis, in many ways engineered by the Americans.
Just because they didn't have a high demand for oil?
Just because they did not have a million cars, which, of course, the Americans are trying to push onto the society, right? They're saying that, why can't you have your Dodge and your Chevrolets, just like they were doing elsewhere in the world. Right. But again, the Yemenis retained a sense of, some exclusivity, if you will. They had no need for this material variety, if you will. And I highlight in the book, this is a period under the man named Ibrahim al-Hamdi, a very charismatic, very much loved nationalist. He was a populist, but also a nationalist. And he was pushing for communes where communities would be self-sufficient in food. They would say, instead of paying taxes directly to the state, they would actually pool their taxes and actually help develop locally. So if they needed a well for water, or if they needed a market, or if they needed a bridge, they would pool the resources and decide themselves. So it was actually a very democratic, very interesting project that was ultimately shut down when this man who was, again, very charismatic and untouchable in terms of removing him through popular politics, was assassinated. And then the French and the Americans tried to character assassinate him, associate him with two dead French women. They put bottles of whiskey next to his dead pictures. And ultimately, the short end of the story is that the man Ali Abdullah Saleh comes to power.
Okay.
And that's the guy for the next 30 years who would make North Yemen incrementally an extension of American power. Again, why? Why is North Yemen such a target for this kind of external influence? Why is USAID pitching all kinds of projects? One, it's agriculturally very rich. One, it's a very interesting pool of human resources that have, in fact, considerable influence in many parts of the Middle East, if not larger world. Like I said, the ruling elites of Malaysia and southern parts of Philippines and many islands of Indonesia all hail from Yemen. But also the ruling family of Abu Dhabi. And family politics within the Gulf becomes more and more obvious as an issue regarding Yemen, as South Yemen becomes increasingly threatening to the, let's say, the Western alliance during the Cold War. And very crucially, it's kind of a turning point in the book, and ultimately explains why Yemen ultimately becomes the kind of center of American expansionism and global finance capital's attention, is in the mid-1980s, then Vice President George Bush, former head of CIA, goes for some reason to this obscure country called North Yemen and signs an agreement on behalf of Hunt Oil from Oklahoma, an oil agreement, which will ultimately lead to the investment of $1 billion into building North Yemen's oil infrastructure.
At what point was exploration done, and how much information do we have at this point about the resource, the oil and gas resources in Yemen?
The funny thing is that we know, I would say, if you look at how maps, if you ever look at oil companies, they have these kind of geological studies. First of all, Yemen geologically is connected with Somalia, with the Horn of Africa. And so much of Somalia, which has been destroyed in the 1990s, in many ways the same fashion as Yemen has been attacked in different ways over the course of 20 years. They're already exploiting Somalia's offshore oils by, first you have these different polities. You have Somaliland, you have Puntland, which are very much separate now and administered by local warlords, and what's remained of Somalia. And they're drilling oil left and right offshore. And that same system, which they think are trillions and trillions of dollars worth of oil and gas under the waters off of Somalia's territorial waters, extends into Yemen. So what you find in Somalia, or Puntland, and Somaliland, you find is an extension that goes all the way to Yemen. And it goes also to the inland as well, all the way to what used to be an unmarked border between Saudi Arabia and South Yemen.
For anyone listening, you really need to look at a map to see how what the strait, there's a Mandeb Strait and Djibouti, and you have to see how close all of these things are and just what a strategic location Yemen is.
Because the Arabian Peninsula geologically was once part of Africa. It's been peeling off for millions of years. So they all share under earth. They all share the resources, right? Whether it be water, fresh water, or gas and petroleum, crude oil. And so, unfortunately, because for the oil companies, they didn't have the time nor the resources to invest in investigating or building infrastructure when the British had nominal control over South Yemen. After, they certainly did not have access to this. Unfortunately for South Yemen as a Marxist state, again, the Soviet Union had no resources, financial resource to actually build capacity for oil that was going at $3 to $4 a barrel. It made no sense. But the geologists who did research, and you can find them in the kind of, they're almost like of lore, right? I mean, the exploration into the empty quarter, which they call that area, that shared border between Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. All these adventure stories for these geologists who worked for BP or for Aramco or for Exxon, going to these areas and living with the natives for 2 or 3 years. They were only able to search around 10-15% of all those potential blocks that countries lease out to oil companies. So we actually don't know the vast majority of the country yet, geologically speaking. But the suspicion is that it's the biggest source of oil in that part of the world, at least. And all they needed was a government that would be compliable, right? That would allow them to do the heavy lifting of investigating where the oil could be most cheaply extracted, and then finding a way to find someone else to finance the building of the infrastructure to extract that oil. It's, again, in 1986, when Vice President Bush goes to North Yemen, oil is at $10 a barrel. It said it's one of its lowest. It's one of those phases where it's at the lowest it could possibly be. South Yemen, still an independent Marxist country, is losing its ally, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's abandoning all its partners in the larger world. It's going because of the Afghan war, because of financial mismanagement. It's going down the way of the what will ultimately be the end of the Soviet Union. In the documentation, you see South Yemeni government is trying to coax other oil companies from Brazil, from Yugoslavia even. They're actually trying to coax the Chinese, others to come and explore and exploit South Yemen's oil. But no one wants to invest the $1 billion it would be necessary, or billions of dollars, to do that. They can't finance it. So it is an issue about finance. And here Bush is coming in as vice president. He's an oil man himself. He's representing Hunt Oil, who signed some obscure agreement, a lease agreement with this Ali Abdullah Saleh in 1981. Remember this is before Yemen is unified. By 86, they're ready to start initiating the first drilling and the building of a pipeline in this obscure part of Yemen, which is just bordering with South Yemen. And the money, it's a very interesting story. It comes out of LA Times when Bush Sr. goes to war with Iraq over Kuwait in 1990-91. There's a little story there where Bush has very close relations with the Saddam Hussein and gets Iraq to finance Hunt Oil's oil exploration and exploitation project in North Yemen. And if you actually look at the politics between Ali Abdullah Saleh and Saddam Hussein, it was North Yemen that showed solidarity to Iraq during the first Gulf War. And Yemen was punished for this gesture of solidarity and saying that, we should, find a peaceful solution. Why are you so eager to go attack attack Iraq? I mean, there should be a negotiated settlement. So all the Gulf countries punished Yemen at that stage by deporting all the workers, Yemeni workers. Over 1 million workers were sent back to Yemen in 1990-91. A catastrophe for Yemen in some ways, and ultimately initiates this process that we're talking about today. But in 1986, Bush, even though oil was at its lowest prices since the crisis of 1973-74, has getting Hunt Oil access to North Yemen, and there's a third country building the infrastructure. So basically Hunt Oil is getting all the contracts to install this infrastructure, but it's Iraq that's financing it. And through various regimes of loans, North Yemen would then also ultimately, through these loans, pay the rest of it. So this is how it's a classic example of how empire works. Global finance capital only functions through this kind of machinations, political machinations. Third parties are the ones who are always providing the kind of resources for American empire or British empire to actually lay a claim to these territories. And that initiates the oil period for North, and then ultimately South Yemen, because where the oil is situated, basically it's shared wells, shared resources. So ultimately, if there's going to be a maximization of exploitation of Yemen's oil, the country will have to unify in some way or another. And that's where the pressure from 1986 onwards towards unification takes place. And Ali Abdullah Saleh and his partner, a guy named Deed from the south, forms a union with Yes, the patriotic reasons, Yemen will become the most potentially vibrant country, population-wise, the largest in the Arabian Peninsula. If they can exploit their oil, they'll be the richest country in Arabia. It would have the strongest military, a unified military, which it did. It's within first couple of months of unification, it challenges Saudi Arabia over disputed territories, defeats Saudi mercenary forces. Saudis don't have an actual army, right? They have only mercenaries they hire from Pakistan and elsewhere. So very quick change of events makes Yemen potentially a superpower in the region.
And we have the decline and fall of the Soviet Union at the same time. So
at the same time,
perfect opportunity now.
Perfect opportunity, and there's no guarantee that the Bushes in particular like per se the Saud family, and they don't necessarily want to have to deal with constantly the consequences of being associated with this Saud regime, which is incredibly corrupt and wasteful. And yes, the mechanisms of global finance capital requires the flow of wealth that's produced by the oil industry to flow back to Western banks, but that could be assured in different ways. And the interesting investment in Yemen at this stage, it could also be seen as a counterbalance to what could have happened if Ali Abdullah Saleh took a more progressive route, the traditional Yemeni position in the outside world. So what they were trying to do is the inevitability of a shift in power in the region, manage that while also exploiting the possibility of a financial moment of a window of opportunity where others would be willing to pay for the development infrastructure in a vast, maybe the richest part of the Middle East in terms of oil that has yet been untapped. And more importantly, make sure that other rival interests do not gain access to this area. Now, who those rivals are is difficult to tell because sometimes you see there's a lot of collusion between these, especially the companies themselves. But there could have easily been some outside player taking advantage of the availability of all this oil, perhaps China at this time, right? Even though China dropped the ball and didn't help finance South Yemen when it needed some solidarity in the late 1980s. By 1990-91, Yemen is unified. Yemenis are a little bit confused about this because they're actually very patriotic and they see this as a window of opportunity for a new era for Yemen. And that's the last thing that those who had invested in the Middle East over the course of the 20th century would ever allow to actually threaten the assets that especially the British and certain American interests had with Saudi Arabia. And that's the beginning of Yemen's very conflicted, let's say, modern relationship with empire. It's one a byproduct. It's resistance to especially American interventions from the interwar period to post World War II. It's advocacy for progressive causes like Pan-Arabism, not losing it all. It's spiritual associations. Maintaining strong cultural productivity made Yemen, especially a unified Yemen, it's a country of great potential. And sadly, the subsequent few years, again, more internal politics leads to a civil war, which the Saudis are providing support for both sides in some way, leads to a final disaggregation of what could have been a unified, permanently vibrant Yemen. And that's 1994, when actual competing elements of the unified Yemeni armed forces are shooting at each other, shooting Scud missiles at each other. And it's basically a window of opportunity to enter into the fray with their tried and true methods, political Islam. And that's where you begin to see the rise of, especially in these isolated areas, first the rise of radical Takfiri groups throughout Yemen, used often by Ali Abdullah Saleh to uproot the resistance from southern Yemen, who had by 1993, 94 realized unification was not all that it was meant to be.
Now, I know that you're limited in time, but it feels like we are moving into a different era at this point. Well, we're approaching the end of the Salah reign, and the Hadi reign is when this current war starts. And I know that there's a lot of interesting things about Hadi and what he tries to do. Would you be willing to continue to do a part two?
Yes.
Or
I can do this now if you want. So here there are party politics involved. There's certain rents that political actors throughout Yemen acquire by being aligned with certain political parties or personalities. I won't complicate too much the various families who become increasingly important in this post-unification process. But one family, Al-Ahmad family, is an extended clan that has already been in politics since the 1950s and 1960s, really become an important asset for the Saudi and then later on Qatar interest. It's they who will embrace political Islam, its most radical form, and it is they who will start to introduce sectarianism in ways that are completely new to Yemeni society.
Are they a rival of Salah, or are they?
They are occasionally rivals. It goes back and forth. They're constantly figuring out ways to share power, and then when there are moments of opportunity, one tries to exploit the apparent opportunity at the other's expense. But I would say they're more or less married at the hip in many ways over the course of this night, especially in the 1990s. And it's with the use of these radicalized, mostly Yemenis. Remember, until 1990-91, when more than a million were thrown out of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar as a result of Ali Abdullah Salah's supposed support of Saddam Hussein, they all and many of them had spent time in Saudi Arabia and had been indoctrinated in radical forms of Takfiri, Salafist, Wahhabism. And so they no longer had jobs. You pay them, you find one local imam who is under the gets paid by Riyadh or paid by one of the local allies of Riyadh, member of the Ahmad family perhaps. And you begin to have now a kind of parallel society that's emerging with mostly people who are now without jobs and who are looking for gainful employment. North Yemen does not have the capacity to take these people in anymore. They had, again, for generations been outside, sending money back in. So now when you suddenly have this influx of 1 million able-bodied men who had maintained families by sending money back, it becomes somewhat of a crisis. And with these kinds of economic crises affecting the poorest of the poor, people who don't have land of their own, and are increasingly living in cities or emerging mid-sized towns, they become perfect targets for radicalization if they had not been radicalized already. Mm. And so they're being given weapons, and they're being given the kind of rhetoric to, in very hostile terms, attack their neighbors. I mentioned what Takfirism actually is. It's a reference to pointing fingers at others. You don't wear your beard correctly. You don't wear your clothes correctly. You don't watch after your women. You are not following Islam. And it becomes actually not only a verbal kind of abuse, it becomes a justification for physically attacking those who are now not abiding by Islam, according to some old guy in Saudi Arabia. And Yemen is slowly falling apart at the seams because of this introduction of this new element in society. And it's attached to also to the poverty that these people now are experiencing for really the first time in a long time in Yemen. And because of the way the Americans have been able to transform the agricultural economy to one producing mostly cash crops, Yemen is now, by the mid-1990s, importing 90% of its food, which is directly impacted by the inflationary dynamics of global commerce. So there are lots of factors that are contributing to the frustrations as well as anxieties of many of these people who will then embrace radical Islam as a means to pay, to bring food to the table. It's instrumentalized in this way, as it's been instrumentalized in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, in Afghanistan, as we know. And so on top of this, it's a political asset that Ali Abdullah Saleh can either be destroyed with, or if he harnesses it, he can actually use it to secure even greater power. And that's what he chooses the latter. He works in tandem with some of these charismatic figures who are leading some of these groups. Now, in the meantime, there are direct responses at the theological level to this radicalism. So it's not to say that the country becomes entirely Wahhabi. It does not. Yemenis, at the majority, continue to maintain a certain kind of standard of civility, and they resist this kind of nasty politics that uses religion as a kind of bludgeon over people's head. And is
it taking hold in certain parts of the country more than
yes.
others? Mm-hmm.
Yes. Again, these are areas that are isolated either by geography. They establish schools or centers that are sometimes very provocatively, while isolated from the villages in the middle of areas that are going to be directly targeted for expansion, or on the fringes of cities in the slums, so to speak, where you traditionally find these kinds of activities, these recruitment activities taking place. And because Qatar, by the late 1990s, through Al Jazeera and has ability to raise all kinds of revenues and sides with the Muslim Brotherhood form of this kind of radical Islam, you have yet another player throwing more resources at Yemenis in order to gain influence into the region.
Are they competing with the Saudis at this point?
At this point, they are competing with the Saudis. And the third major player, who had, again, long, very personal, intimate relations through the mother of the ruling family, of the founder of Abu Dhabi, or of modern Abu Dhabi, whom they hate radical Islam. I mean, the one place one could say where you will not find openly Muslim Brotherhood or Wahhabism is in the United Arab Emirates. And they've been very vigilant from the first day they took power after becoming independent to today to keep those elements out of their society. And they're seeing their homeland back in Yemen being infiltrated by their biggest enemies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Even though, again, on the surface, in public, sometimes the relationship seems to be all hunky-dory and that they're actually collaborating and working together in coalition. There's actually, beneath the surface, a lots of tension, and it's been going on for a long time. Today, it manifests in Yemen in very important ways, which I'll get to in a second. Right. But just for your audience to bear in mind, Saudi Arabia still occupies Abu Dhabi territory. If you look at a map, there should be a shared border between Abu Dhabi and Qatar. At some point, with the Americans' help in the 50s and 60s, they actually encouraged the Saudis to expand into Omani territory, Abu Dhabi territory, and other areas of what becomes the coastline of Saudi Arabia on the eastern side. So Abu Dhabi still very quietly has territorial disputes with Saudi Arabia. They see them as danger, not only through the radical Islam, but also as a kind of territorial expansionist state that's constantly threatening to take Abu Dhabi's oil resources. And why this is important with the areas that I'm talking about, with the now emerging, since the 1990s, emerging kind of areas in which only radical Muslims can gravitate and interact, is that's where the oil is. That's where the water is. And this is the area that extends into this empty quarter that there was no boundary ever drawn. As long as the British were there, they were never going to allow American-influenced Saudi Arabia to determine where the border will be, because everyone knew that there was large pockets of oil there. During the Cold War, you had this Marxist South Yemeni state that militarily would never allow anyone to steal land from them. Potentially even this unified Yemen would never allow new territorial acquisitions at the expense of Yemen. So you have this kind of interesting introduction of a new element that's going to break the seams of what could have potentially been a unified Yemen, break it apart. And some of the regional powers, like the UAE, is looking at this and is very concerned. Now, Hadi, who would be the vice president and, let's say, co-chair of the General Congress Party, the kind of big political party that Ali Abdullah Saleh used as his kind of legitimate reflection of his power, Hadi had maintained an interesting relationship with, and in many ways was an intermediary for the Yemeni government with Saudi Arabia in particular. And so he had strong relations. He's not very charismatic. He's actually in many ways a weak political kind of figure, but he was important because he came from the south, and he could in some way symbolically bring the two parts of Yemen together on behalf of not only his political party with Ali Abdullah Saleh, but also Saudi Arabia.
Whereas Ali Abdullah Saleh, he was able to he was able to play the powers off of each other in some ways, wasn't he?
At some point in time, he demonstrated an ability to maintain independence. He knew how to extract maximal concessions from a number of players, both domestically as well as regionally and internationally. He had, I'm not saying that he's entirely a puppet of the first Bush, right? I mean, he clearly was attuned to the politics of the day, and he secured himself a position of influence, which kept him in power until 2011, and influential until he ultimately was killed trying to flee Sana'a in 17, sorry. So back to unified Yemen, having this Takfiri political Islam introduced into the fray, you have this a political apparatus through party politics. Yemeni has actually very fair elections in 1993. It's a very dynamic political space. You had incredible range of newspapers published every day. It was actually a gold mine for looking at how intellectuals in the larger Arab world talked, because they would all publish op-ed pieces in these various, very different competing newspapers. So it was really an interesting place, even in the 1990s. And what we're beginning to see, again, there's the questions about who's developing infrastructure. The pipelines have slowly but surely expanded and connected both the Red Sea with the Indian Ocean. There's now investment from especially Qatari interests with various American, German, Austrian conglomerates working alongside. Investments in liquefied natural gas, which is what really is the forte of Qatar. But in the meantime, with the rise of especially Dubai, but larger UAE, especially using global finance to their advantage, able to borrow money cheaply or to secure investment from the larger Islamic world into not only developing Dubai into what it is today, but also redirecting those assets to buying up important strategic assets in the neighboring region. So Dubai Ports World is slowly but surely signing long-term lease agreements with Ali Abdullah Saleh's government, including the maintenance of the Aden port, the maintenance of Mukalla, which is another port where the liquefied natural gas infrastructure is built. UAE companies are buying heavily into mining, especially gold. Yemen is incredibly wealthy for its minerals as well. So huge finds of gold, $10 billion, $15 billion kind of production, dollars worth of production anticipated. And this is all happening in the late 1990s. You've had various attempts at trying to consolidate and influence what's going on in Yemeni politics from the outside through Takfiri Islam. And then you have this, for whatever reason, which is maybe too complicated, definitely too complicated to talk about now, Yemen and Saudi Arabia are forced to come to an agreement about actually finally delineating the border. And it has a lot to do with we're not going to develop the oil until we actually get a legal idea of who owns what or who can claim what, because oil companies don't like to sign lease agreements and give money to governments that do not have territorial claim or solid legal claims to the assets. And so as they increasingly see the ability, the capacity, and the will to invest in developing this area of South Yemen's oil assets, they need a solid border. And Yemen finally agrees. For many nationalists, they're very upset because that area that I mentioned way back when we started our conversation about the areas that Saudi Arabia expanded and has been occupying since 1934 was finally consolidated into a border. And it's a border agreement of 2000 that really starts the violence that we are associated with the war today in Yemen and the so-called rise of this so-called group around a charismatic figure named Houthi. And this is the so-called Houthi movement that emerges in the mid-1990s in uproar against this rise of political Islam that's directly affecting their communities, which happens to be all along the northwest border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So clearly deemed to be strategic enough to actually try to destabilize this region. This is an area that has been thriving for 30, 40 years because it smuggles all this stuff that goes into Saudi Arabia. There's a big market in Saudi Arabia for all kinds of drugs and for cheap labor, and it all comes from this part of Yemen.
So
the people,
the trafficking route, it has
yes,
positioned on the Red Sea, which is becoming more and more
exactly
strategic.
Yeah.
And it's
exactly.
not so much for their resources. It's because of the resistance, the location, and because the oil companies want solid legal terms before they invest and develop. Clearly things are building up to develop Yemen.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, the areas where the oil is further east in Marib and then areas in the Hadramaut, which would today be considered South Yemen, and is more or less now militarily under occupation of one element or another. But back in those days, it still needed the kind of legal framework to actually start investing heavily in it. And that's why this agreement took place. The people on the ground, however, were directly affected by this, and they resisted. And the attempt to militarize this border, to actually make it illegal for people who have long lived on both sides of the border, taking their animals whenever the water availed itself to one area to the other, again, trading all these illicit goods that the Saudi market demands for, made enemies out of some of the most resilient and basically militarily undefeatable people in that part of the world. And it's become an easy kind of calculation to say that, well, they're just supporters of this charismatic member of parliament who is also somewhat connected spiritually with the Zaidi. They're not 12er Shia like in Iran. In fact, Iran until very recently had always deemed these Yemenis of Zaidi abstraction as being not real Shia. And so their cultural connections were non-existent. Legally, this group that we identified today as Shia in Yemen are actually much more close to Shafi Sunnis. So the game that's now being played, calling them Iranian stooges, just doesn't have any kind of historical grounding, and nor does it have any ideological grounding. The reason why these people have been in revolt since 2000 at least, there have been actually 6 or 7 wars between the central state of Yemen, and in 2009, even Saudi Arabia directly invaded North Yemen to try to deal with this resistance in this area along the border. Every time they failed. And what has happened is that the coalition around this, what was once a very isolated border area communities, has expanded to much of northwest Yemen. So it's not even something that we could argue anymore as being spiritually or politically influenced by a man named Houthi. It is actually a much larger trans-regional alliance that includes much of northern Yemen. And this is a response to this rather aggressive, by 2000, 2006, 2008, and then ultimately into the teens, this aggressive move, concessions made by Ali Abdullah Saleh to put Yemen directly into a regime that's imposed from the outside, what we call these austerity regime, right? This aggressive campaign to privatize Yemen's assets, to borrow money from the IMF regime, to start inducing some kinds of austerity in areas that had long been benefiting from state subsidies. And on top of that, you had the violence. There were these 6 or 7 wars that Yemen state, Ali Abdullah Saleh's loyal Republican Guard, with Saudi and American assistance. And this is the whole drone warfare starts in this period. We are sold that the experimentation with use of drones and then double tap techniques are all to fight Al-Qaeda. In fact, they're actually being used to fight against Ali Abdullah Saleh's enemies in these areas. And they're not always radical Islamic elements. And so this is where we really begin to see the utility of framing Yemen in terms of the war on terror, and then framing Yemen in terms of this very simplistic language, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. It's a cover for a much deeper, complex explanations for why certain groups of parties have unified against first Ali Abdullah Saleh, then against his successor, and then ultimately this larger community of very aggressive, interested parties that want what Yemen has. First and foremost, its natural resources, but also it needs to subdue Yemen. It needs to actually bring Yemen to its knees in order to secure those assets.
And doesn't Hadi also attempt to tip the scales in the favor of the Saudis and
yes.
push the Arab Emirates out?
Yes, exactly.
Which they were having no part of.
Yes. So as I mentioned, in the 1990s already, business deals done between, especially Southerners. So why is UAE so close to Yemen? After the fall of the British in 1967, many of these ruling families that had long collaborated with British Empire, what we call sultans or princes, and most of them fled. And many of them ended up in what remained of the British Empire in the Persian Gulf, including Abu Dhabi. And then they started to settle in Ajman, in Dubai, in Sharjah, in Abu Dhabi, and they intermarried. And many of them married their daughters off to the ruling families. And so by their mother line, the line of the mother, the rulers of Abu Dhabi have connections to South Yemen. And they've used this in the 1990s as people started going back once the communist regime had collapsed and once unification took place. Many of these families went back to their hometowns and they started doing business. And they started doing business most logically with those where they had done business for the previous 30 years, which was Ajman in the UAE. And that's where the leases took place. This is where Dubai Ports World started getting access, and basically we're managing Aden Port, Mukalla, and all these other important infrastructure issues. They started investing heavily in developing certain kinds of agricultural products, mining, offshore fisheries. These were all big investments that when the resistance to the shenanigans in the northwest of Yemen, because of the border issue that I had mentioned, when they ultimately aligned and created popular forces in the cities itself, and ultimately pushed in the form of what we would call today the Arab Spring of early 2011. It was actually a movement that was cutting across many different divides in Yemeni society and largely supported militarily by those guys who had been fighting Ali Abdullah Saleh and fighting the Saudis in the mountains of what we call today northwest Yemen. So in 2011, Ali Abdullah Saleh had to go. He couldn't maintain this cozy relationship between a formal Yemeni state and the larger world. This could have easily gone out of control and become a very popular revolution where you could really have a different kind of government being put in place. And in fact, all those committees that were formed in the streets of the big cities of Yemen were clearly pointing to that direction. So what happened is you had the Americans under the Obama administration with Qatar primarily. Qatar had a lot of influence in the Obama administration, especially with the Clintons. They got their person in the form of this this woman, charismatic woman who ultimately became the winner of the Nobel Prize at the time. She, representing the Muslim Brotherhood, were able to assert themselves with her name is Mutawakil Karaman. And under the agreement that they would bring a stabilizing government, meaning we will not allow a popular revolt to take place. We will not see the reversal of this austerity regime being introduced, thanks to Ali Abdullah Saleh. We will, because that was much of the rhetoric, right? Bring back the subsidies for bread, bring back the subsidies for fuel, bring back state support for healthcare, for education. All those things that were removed during this period of austerity were the demands made by the people on the streets. So the interim government, they created some kind of very problematic committee that would be negotiating for a new constitution. They started promoting the idea of federalization, which would disaggregate the unified Yemen into 6 different units, giving much of the oil and gas to one particular territory, which would happen to also be the least populated territory, and the imposition through this interim government of Hadi. You begin to realize that empire is making one final move with Yemen.
And this is the point in time when you had a UN envoy conducting these negotiations, and it actually came up with a deal, right?
No, that's a little bit later. That's after already. Yeah, this is now beginning of 2012 when the various factions who had taken over the streets and basically overthrew Ali Abdullah Saleh basically agreed to step aside and allow for an internationally backed coalition negotiate over an interim period of 2 years and have a final kind of a proper constitution written that would guarantee voting rights and protect the large number of Yemenis who were directly affected by what was clearly a problem. But again, this was just buying time, and the fact that they imposed this character Hadi, who had really no backing politically in Yemen itself,
and he had ties to the Saudis, right? I mean, he was representing their interests.
That's right. He had a strong relationship with the Saudis, and at this time begin to see that Qatar has also wedged its way in through an important political party called Islah Party, which was the Muslim Brotherhood branch of this larger international operation we associate called the Muslim Brotherhood. They had throughout the 2000s back and forth with Ali Abdullah Saleh, became important actors in Yemeni politics and became the biggest second party, if you will. And they were able to secure. Qatar and Saudi Arabia came to an agreement that they would basically share their resources and basically share the spoils of their successful stemming of a revolution in Yemen, with, of course, the oversight of the United Nations and the Americans basically leading the way, giving it the kind of imperial seal of approval that was necessary.
And were the Emirates left out in the cold from this?
The Emirates would be left out in the cold, and this was manifested very quickly. Once they had that kind of silly one-man election where only Hadi was on the ballot,
right.
They had the procedure of an election, but there was really no contestation here. He would be given this mandate, supposedly, of just 2 years to actually set up an interim government, have these negotiations over a constitution, and then ultimately organize elections in 2 years' time. The problem is that he was, by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and American agreement, given full responsibilities as a sovereign leader. So the very first thing he did, as now recognized president, this is the language we still use about him, right? The recognized Yemeni government. He's representing that, even though he was never elected, and he has actually no political following inside Yemen itself.
And his term has expired.
His term would expire in 2 years. The first thing he did was sign Yemen, which was never done before, into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which meant that Yemen would have to abide then to new kinds of rules, which would be so-called free trade. It would have to open its markets to any and all exports or imports. It would have to break down all kinds of tax barriers. And it would initiate a rethinking of all the previous commercial agreements signed, including all those leases that Dubai and Abu Dhabi had signed throughout the 90s. And basically Hadi started ripping up all these agreements. and then issuing new calls for lease agreements, which then would all go to Qatari and Saudi companies.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so that was that kind of, it was that kind of bait and switch. They started now shifting entirely the influence and much of the infrastructure that had been invested in with Abu Dhabi and Dubai financing had basically been appropriated by the Yemeni state on behalf of Saudi and Qataris.
Now, are the Saudis and Qataris doing this in a hostile way toward the Emiratis? Or are they, telling them we'll take care of you later? Or are they at war? Or are they they can't go to a Cold War?
It's a Cold War. You can't have a shooting. I mean, even though there are always incidences, these are all state secrets. One does not show their dirty laundry to the public, right? Okay. And this is also kept very under close guard by the Americans and the British and the French, who all have their bases in these countries, right?
It sounds like a war.
Yeah, well, it's an economic war. It's a war of culture, right? The UAE is always being bombarded by these aggressive political Islamic voices from Qatar news channels or from the Saudi Arabia. So they're in a very precarious situation, and it became very clear after 2012 with this puppet regime, the Americans sitting very carelessly aside and allowing Qatari and Saudis to basically swallow up much of Yemen, including more importantly, its oil and gas future assets, right? Again, we have not yet explored 90% of all the potential blocks of oil and gas, especially offshore.
And the price of oil is high at the moment.
Yeah,
and also
and so now
alternative energy is rising, and there's an urgency to pump and sell this stuff while you can.
So there is this oil industrial complex at play. Of course, then there's the military industrial complex that is also at play, right? I mean, these are the big winners in the American empire at this stage, and those are the main, let's say, beneficiaries of the oil money being recycled back into Western economies, as well as banks, which after 2007, 2008, liquidity is a huge issue, right? And everybody's running for cash. Where is the money? And Yemenis is one of those places. I failed to mention all these little, they're all in my chapter 5. There are examples of Yemen being somewhat of a laboratory for these products that by now are synonymous with the global economy. But for instance, microfinance was first introduced into Yemen, where they were trying to induce Yemenis who were notoriously frugal and spent, saved their money and only spent their money when needed. And so they had resources, they had savings, they had land. And so there were all these attempts to induce through USAID sponsored programs, through this thing called Amal Bank, which was basically funded by Deutsche Bank, to try to get Yemenis into debt. Not only the country, but individuals themselves. When you had 25 million people who were outside the global financial mechanisms. It's very curious to look at the story through those elements as well, those kind of key moments when Yemen first issues currency, when it first gets a central bank, when it first starts to push people to pay money, not in kind, but through currency. And then with this microfinancing, inducing people to borrow small amounts of money, to become permanently indebted, to put their land as collateral. It's all these kinds of games that are being played, that had been played out in South Asia with the initial use of microfinance. In Yemen, I suggest actually it's taking place more or less independently because there's an Islamic finance component to it, which is now very popular in the banking industry. So Yemen has always been targeted for kind of seeing how these tools of empire, of corporate power, of finance capital can actually weed its way into these societies. And even though there's a war now going on in Yemen, you see now news reports in these occupied southern parts of Yemen, new initiatives for more microfinance, right? So they're showing pictures of more women who are borrowing $15, $20 to start her little business, which seems innocent enough and seems great, but why do they have to borrow that money? Why are they putting up for collateral the rest of their life as labor, right, in order to pay back something that can be a disastrous amount of debt?
Yeah, right.
And so the fact that Hadi, the first thing he does is get Yemen into this regime of the World Trade Organization. Then he starts borrowing money. Then he starts lifting all of these subsidies that had been returned back to the people. So people are again having to pay so-called market prices for all their goods and services. Basically leads to a point where at the point of 2 years when there should have been elections, there should have been a new constitution, all that Yemenis saw was Hadi saying, well, we need to extend another year. No, it's not going to happen. This is it. And that's when the resistance exploded again in the same areas, the northwest, what we today are being forced to call the Houthi movement, or an extension of the Iranians, where in fact, again, it's Yemeni people around this coalition called Ansar Allah, or the Party of God, has coalesced around a resistance against Qatari, Saudi power through this Hadi guy, and obviously hostility towards the Americans, whom they've associated from day one, since this 2011 events at least, with this regime of extreme exploitation, of impoverishing people, stealing their resources, forcing people into debt. And that's basically the pretext for ultimately stemming this popular uprising that led to the arrest of Hadi, and then ultimately forcing him out.
That coalition included the former president Salah, and a big part of the military.
Oh,
you're not
exactly.
There? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But the reason why Salah, the political master, if you will, reading the winds, the reason why he personally embraced this revolution, one, it was the idea that he could potentially get back into power, that he can maintain some kind of claim to what's going on in North Yemen. And what's so interesting about this, again, coalition that ultimately very quickly takes over the capital and arrests this corrupt Hadi. Not only that, they go after all these Islamic fundamentalist groups, these armed groups, Al-Qaeda. Despite the fact the Americans say they're fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces, it's this coalition who then proceeds southwards. They reach Aden. They actually occupy Aden. They actually go and throw out these areas that have been inhabited by these Takfiri groups since the early 1990s. And, one would think that there would be some kind of an about face in realizing that actually these guys are our allies if, in fact, you're fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces. But they're clearly, all the cards were put on the table at this moment. If people will actually start paying attention to what was going on in this very 3-year period, you could see everything that's happening in the larger Middle East coming at play and basically exposing Empire's card very clearly. So clearly they had to reverse this rather rapid and unanticipated turn of events. And here comes this UN official who said, look, we were actually negotiating. Hadi had to negotiate finally because he was under house arrest. They had established these committees in the beginning, started looking into the books of just how corrupt his interim government was, how much money they were actually stealing when they were in power for just, this 3 years. Yes, of course, we'll negotiate. So basically, they could have come to a peace agreement where they would be laying down the arms, where they would basically return the military bases that this Ansar Allah, so-called Houthis, had captured. And they could have gone back to square one, basically, saying that we're going to have a new committee, which will include now people from the north who were excluded during this last 3 years, including those people who were what we call Hirak, which are the independence movement in the south, those who want to recreate a South Yemen. They too were also left out in 2011 from the post so-called overthrow of Ali Abdullah Saleh. So you basically had a perfect moment for actually getting back to the negotiation table, starting afresh. And that was the last thing that the Barack Obama administration, the Saudis and the Qataris wanted, because what that would do is basically force the hand of all of their assets on the ground to basically make concessions. And so basically they initiated the war. The war was, in theory, supposed to be an easy one. They anticipated to win a very quick one. Now, the reason why the Saudis especially didn't have time to wait it out for another 5 or 6 years and maybe share some of the spoils of whatever a unified Yemen would bring in terms of trade between equal partners is that it's financially in a black hole.
Now,
and it's been
now we have an urgency that wasn't there before because
it's probably
Saudis are in big trouble.
Yeah,
and the prices are down.
Oil has dipped back down. They need basically oil prices around $90, $100 in order to basically break even. So they're losing money every day. They're also facing the fact that it's becoming quite clear in the industry. If you actually talk to people in Zurich and elsewhere who trade in oil, that its assets in the Far East, in the far eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, are actually dwindling. And they actually have not found new wells in a long, long time.
So this is the Saudis, right? They're running out of oil, in other words.
This is the Saudi. They're running out of oil. People in finance know this. They're not paying the bills. They haven't been paying the bills for a long time. Kind of like Donald Trump, where basically you coax people into greedily start building a project, and then at midway you say, well, you're not going to get paid anymore, and you better finish because you may want another project later on. So it's become notorious that you don't do business in Saudi Arabia. And they ultimately screwed the last of the most important players who were independent in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago, the Bin Laden Group. The Bin Laden Group, who's obviously the most famous son, Osama bin Laden, the Bin Laden Group is responsible for building much of Saudi Arabia and in many other parts of the world. They're one of these big construction companies like Bechtel and others who have long profited from the oil industrial complex. They had plans to actually build a bridge connecting Djibouti with Yemen and then link basically Arabia with with highland Ethiopia, which is where all this investment in food. I don't know if you've been following the financial news over the last 5 or 6 years, but the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf countries, as well as Saudi Arabia, are desperately looking for sources of food. And like South Korea and other major countries that import lots of food, they go to Africa and hoping to develop vast territory, basically colonies, to grow and provide food security. So the idea was to connect the water that would be created by the damming of the Nile River, the Blue Nile, which was very controversial for Egypt and Sudan, and then develop Ethiopia's capacity to grow industrial scale crops for this big market in the neighboring Arabian Peninsula. And it would be connected by infrastructure with a train, which the Chinese have maintained, connecting Ethiopia with Djibouti, and then this bridge that the Bin Laden Group had already commissioned reports, the feasibility reports. They already had the numbers necessary. They were looking for finance. All this was in this vision that ultimately we associate now with this Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia 2030, right?
Right.
They basically wanted to build a series of cities just like Dubai on the coast with the Red Sea. So they had big ambitions, but they had no finance. They tried to sell that, yes, we're the greatest oil producing country in the world. They kept selling the story that they had oil. We can borrow money off the futures of that oil. But then it became clear that actually Aramco does not have the actual assets. It does a lot of buying offshore oil and then reselling and repackaging as its own. And it certainly helps when you have countries like Iraq and Syria and Libya that are in war. Yeah. So there's lots of non-sovereign oil flowing around. So basically you can just stick ships offshore, upload the oil and then sell it in the market. And, you can put some kind of corporate figure on it or symbol on it. So Aramco, in the industry, Aramco is known for running out of assets. And so Yemen's assets, the oil assets that everybody in the industry knows is there. It just needs to be exploited. If they could somehow acquire that territory, just, in one quick swoop with the help of Hadi, bring Hadi back into power and give Aramco exclusive right to access this huge resources that links Saudi Arabia and the Indian Ocean, that would have resolved the long-term kingdom's problem. But it was not an easy victory. They had to actually go through these northwest areas, and they thought they could bomb them in submission. They very quickly destroyed all infrastructure that would help feed these people. They bombed their water wells. They bombed their food processing plants. They bombed the dairy farms. They bombed the chicken farms. They used cluster bombs on the farms, and they put a full embargo on this area where there's 22 million people living. The problem is they could not defeat these people. And in the meantime, their coalition is actually a coalition of mercenary units that are running around causing havoc in southern Yemen, and the UAE, which is much more heavily invested in making sure that Qatar and Saudi Arabia do not steal Yemen from under its nose. And that's how it's playing itself out now in the south, which is a very divided territory. You have this separatist movement getting support from the UAE to stop the so-called legitimate Hadi government from establishing a foothold in these areas. And the Saudis, although we saw what happened to Qatar, they were more or less pushed out. There was hostilities between these countries finally emerged. And I suspect Saudi Arabia wanted to also acquire Qatari assets very quickly, like they did in Bahrain in 2011. But the problem is that Turkey and Iran were immediately stepping in to stopping that from happening. So it's a mess. Yemen has created a mess. It's the greed. And then it's actually a story of finance, of debt financing. And Saudi Arabia cannot borrow money anymore at cheap rates. It's now having to borrow at short term at 6, 7, 8%. Now, if you're looking at what's happening with American markets and the Treasury bill, and there's concern now that the cost of borrowing is going to go up and up and up for the larger world. That's a disaster for Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. And you have the Aramco IPO that keeps getting
delayed. Yeah.
And that's actually what made me think that the Yemen war was about resources, which no one ever says. That it's the other thing more that's coming out into the mainstream news is that the United Arab Emirates has taken control of the Socotra Island, is it? Which I didn't know anything about until recently. But it's not only a fascinating place, but it's a fascinating location.
Yeah.
In the middle of
it controls all of the Western Indian Ocean. It's like Diego Garcia of the past, right? And whoever controls Socotra probably has access to offshore resources, to the fisheries, which Yemen has probably the most unexploited fisheries in the world now. Talk about food politics. There's another element that no one talks about.
And then you have the Chinese with the New Silk Road, where the Suez Canal is going to become even more significant than ever. Yeah. And I don't quite understand the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China and this project that you mentioned, because, suddenly we are, worried about China as a rival, and that's a complicated thing in itself. A different conversation, I guess.
Yeah, it's quite telling that China is basically quiet on the war in Yemen. And it's pretty damning, I think, for the rest of the world to look at, where are our friends? Where are the progressive forces of the world going to rely on? Is it China? No, clearly. They're in it for the business. They're in business with Sudan, and Sudan sends thousands of mercenaries to die in Yemen. It's very interesting. China sees this as, they wait it out and they'll be victors anyway. I mean, they already had heavily invested in Yemen during this period from the late 1990s to 2000s. And they certainly are going to benefit from whoever wins, whatever happens to Yemen. They're going to be also big players in this. So they don't need to get invested in what's going on. So Qatar is obviously strategic importance. It doesn't take much to occupy the island. It probably will take a lot to sustain it. You can see the coalition is publicly now at odds with each other regarding Socotra. You have Saudis saying, and the former American ambassador to Yemen, who most likely is close to Qatar in all this, saying that this is an illegal move by UAE, that UAE needs to be condemned by the UN. So this is actually becoming very quickly a public dispute, but it's manifested for a long time now in South Yemen on the mainland between forces. UAE is really the only country that has committed its own troops to this war. And so a lot of, unfortunately for them, a lot of Emiratis are coming back in body bags. And that's a big investment for a country like that to do. And so it says that there's a lot at stake for UAE, and it's probably even more at stake for Saudi Arabia to end this war quickly, and it's just not going to happen. So I think, unfortunately, for the so-called coalition that the Americans, I think, under the Trump administration is actually throwing, I personally feel, is throwing fuel to the fire, is actually instigating, and that curious meeting that he had with the Globe, if you recall, when he went to Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of dirty politics going on behind closed doors, and you can see that Qatar very quickly afterwards got pushed aside, and there's some interesting things that we maybe will only learn years from now about all of this. But I suspect that the biggest dynamic is this rush to end this conflict, but not to end it in a way that we go back to square one. Saudi cannot do that anymore. It's already invested too much of its future on securing the assets of Yemen, and definitely trying to sell the story that it's actually a dynamic, forward-looking empire. Right? We need investors to come to Saudi Arabia. This is that whole point of that whole trip that this bin Salman made to Britain and to the United States, which unfortunately much of the media has been bought out to tell that story, that Saudi Arabia is reforming, that it's actually a place where we should all send our retirement funds to invest in. That would be the last
bright future, and really the truth of the matter is they're in big trouble.
And that we should always look at this war and what happens in subsequent months from this perspective. There's desperation here. And there's desperation also in the global context with important players in the United States as well. I mean, there's a big crisis coming. And so everyone's positioning themselves, defining themselves, safe haven, if you will, where they're going to park their wealth, or if it's under threat of being extracted or stolen. I mean, this bin Salman's been stealing the money of all his cousins, right? He's been arresting these people, torturing them, and basically forcing them to open up their bank accounts. He even arrested the prime minister of Lebanon, whose father, Hariri, made billions in Saudi Arabia, and I'm pretty sure he had to pay a ransom to get out and get his children out. So this is really getting down to kind of the wild, wild west, of the 19th century. So it's ugly. Millions of people are starving to death or on the throes of death in Yemen. No one gives a damn about them, which is just, for me, so shameful. And remarkably, they are resisting, despite the fact that the rest of the world basically wants to see this war end in a way that would benefit their own interests. And so I think any of us who care about humanity, care about the little guy, should be behind Yemeni's resistance from day one. And unfortunately, we're stuck in the terminology of proxy wars and Iran versus Saudi Arabia, not appreciating that empire itself, the financing of empire, is dependent on this war turning out one way or the other. And the Yemenis, just like in the 1920s, just like after World War II, just like during the Cold War, have put their foot down and said, not under our watch. That's a quite remarkable little corner of the world in respect to the story of global capitalism.
Yeah, it really is. They're just the sacrificial lambs on the chessboard of empire. And to some extent, we see the same thing with the people of Syria, and it's...
Oh, absolutely. And Iraq, and horrible. And it's coming to the United States. It's come in many subtle ways already. Many of the things that were used elsewhere in the world, from the police state tactics to stealing people's resources. I mean, even the EU, right? If you were in Cyprus and you had a bank account, they could shut your bank account down and steal that money from you. And it's not too far away from happening in the United States. Empire's in trouble, and it's a race now for figuring out, who's going to remain on top. And I assure you, working class Americans, if that's such a class that exists anymore, are going to see the very bloody end of this transition, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's already happening. Yeah. Well, I've kept you for a very long time, and I so appreciate the breadth of your knowledge and your willingness to bring it here to our audience. If you'd like to wrap up, anything else you'd like to say, please do that, and also tell us how to find your work and what we can do to help you.
Well, I just appreciate the opportunity. It's a very frustrating thing to work for many years and have such passion for saying things and telling things the right way, and no one reading what you do. So do what you can, learn a little bit more, read more broadly, and just maybe think once in a while to bring up as a conversation with others over some Starbucks coffee or whatever you guys do, to just bring up Yemen and say, put it in the right terms. Let's change the way we talk about the world. And I know your audience is already convinced about that, but maybe they could be a little more proactive in that sense. And I wish everyone luck in the U.S. And the world can't live with or without the Americans in one way or another. So change in the United States will ultimately lead to change in places like Yemen. So
we're working on it. It's a tough job. And your book, is there a preferred place to purchase the book?
Whatever, if your listeners are so inclined, and whatever they're more comfortable, whatever way they're buying it, they feel. I know Amazon is I shouldn't say anything. It's evil incarnate in many ways, so I don't encourage you to buy it through any conventional ways. But if you have the time, go to a local library and have a library buy it. Yeah.
Okay, and if we want it for our own collection, is it okay?
It's available. You can get it from the publisher directly, or any book provider, I think, will at least order it for you if they don't have it on the shelf.
Okay, I'll put a link to the, I think it's the UC Press, right?
UC Press, yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk to you again sometime soon. I mean, this is a great conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving me the time, and nice to meet you, and all the best.
You too. You too. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that's our show. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Isa Blumi. You can find him on Twitter at Isa Blumi, ISABLUMI. And you can find his book at University of California Press, ucpress.edu. We are independent media. We rely on your contributions. This podcast is brought to you with the help of our generous donors. And you could pitch in by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or doing a one-time donation using the links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, our podcast channels at iTunes and other podcast apps, and also on Facebook. And we'll see you next time. Take care.